The air inside the abandoned workshop felt heavy, thick with the stench of rust, old grease, and sudden, absolute terror. The only light came from a crude, homemade torch, casting desperate, flickering orange shadows against the stained concrete walls. A young man named Olive held the burning rod with shaking hands, his eyes wide as he aimed the fire toward the ceiling. Next to him, a young Malaysian woman with a sharp, determined face named Dania grit her teeth, her knuckles white as she balanced a metal chair directly beneath a smoke detector. Another young woman, her long hair disheveled and tear-streaked, named May, desperately fanned the thick black smoke upward. They were suffocating, but the fire was their only choice. In the far corner of the room, completely bathed in pitch blackness, a heavy metal chair scraped violently against the floor. Tied to that chair was their friend, a tall, broad-shouldered young man named Ryan. But the entity shaking that chair was no longer Ryan. His head rolled back, eyes completely bloodshot, a sickening, unnaturally deep laugh tearing out of his throat. He screamed that they would all remain here forever. Dania did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed on the plastic smoke detector, praying for the fire to trigger the school alarm. Because out of the corner of her eye, she could see a dark, human-shaped mess slowly detaching itself from an old, rusted smelting furnace in the deep shadows. It was gliding toward them. And it was smiling. To understand how these 4 students ended up fighting for their lives in the bowels of their campus, one has to understand the geography of their school. It was an old vocational college located deep in the southern region of the country, built along a series of low, rolling hills covered in dense fruit orchards and vast paddy fields. It was isolated. The nearest bustling town center was a tedious 40-minute motorcycle ride away through winding, unlit roads. Despite its remote location, the campus itself boasted a large student population and a decent reputation. But once the sun dipped below the horizon, the surrounding darkness swallowed the school whole. Dania was a final-year student majoring in multimedia production. She was ambitious, organized, and served as the leader for their crucial graduation project. Together with her team, May, their talented videographer, Ryan, the scriptwriter and lighting coordinator, and Olive, the quiet audio editor and prop master, they were working on a highly ambitious, experimental montage film. They had already shot about 70% of the project, utilizing various outdoor locations, teachers, and volunteer students. All that remained was the final 30%, consisting of stylized indoor scenes and heavy post-production editing. The problem was money. As an independent student group, their production budget was practically non-existent. Renting a professional commercial studio in the city was completely out of the question. Wanting to keep the team on track, Dania proposed an alternative. She reminded them of the old campus basement. Because the college was built directly into the side of a hill, there was a specific wing where the classrooms sat below the level of the main ground floor. These were classrooms 001 through 004. Specifically, Dania wanted to use the old computer lab, room 002, and the abandoned metalworking workshop, room 003. When she brought it up, May immediately grew tense, her voice shaking as she asked Dania if she wasn't afraid of the rumors. Dania, practical to a fault, dismissed the fears entirely. She countered by saying there was nothing to fear, arguing that people passed away everywhere and that a dark history shouldn't stop their progress. But the history of those 2 rooms was exceptionally grim. 7 or 8 years prior, a young art student had been working late into the night inside metalworking room 003. A heavy piece of industrial machinery had suffered a massive electrical leak, sending thousands of volts through his body. By the time he was discovered the next morning, he was fused to the machine, half of his body completely charred. Not long after that tragedy, another student, overwhelmed by a devastating heartbreak, snuck into the adjacent computer lab, room 002, and slit their wrists. Though that student was ultimately found and saved, the double trauma left a stain on the wing. Ghostly sightings, unnatural temperature drops, and the sound of phantom machinery running in the dead of night plagued the area. Terrified, the administration eventually chained the doors shut, leaving the rooms to rot. However, Dania had a secret weapon. Having previously served as the president of the student council, she possessed a good relationship with the faculty. After spending days relentlessly begging and pestering the department head, the administrator finally relented, sliding the old brass keys across the desk. The team began their work in Computer Lab 002. The room was a time capsule of the late 90s, filled with bulky, dust-covered computer monitors, obsolete dot matrix printers, and rows of particle board desks. They set up their gear and began shooting a scene meant to simulate a retro classroom. As Dania monitored the frame through the camera's small digital viewfinder, she suddenly frowned, a wave of annoyance washing over her face. She called out loudly to the empty space behind the monitors, scolding Ryan for accidentally walking into the shot and ruining the take. From the far end of the room, near the back exit, Ryan walked in, shaking his wet hands. He looked confused, stating that he had just gone out to the restroom and hadn't been anywhere near the set. Dania's blood ran cold. She insisted that she had just clearly seen a man dart across the very back row of computers, wearing the exact same distinctive white t-shirt Ryan was wearing. May, feeling a sudden chill in the air, quickly unmounted the camera and played back the last 5 minutes of footage. They all crowded around the small screen, holding their breath. The footage was completely normal. There was no one in the back row. Dania stared at the empty space on the screen, whispering quietly that whatever she saw simply didn't show up on digital sensors. Olive grew visibly upset, cutting her off and telling her to stop talking because she was terrifying everyone. He reminded her bitterly that using these cursed rooms had been her idea in the first place. Trying to shake off the unease, the group shifted their operations to Room 003, the metalworking workshop. This space was massive, designed to hold heavy furnaces, anvils, and dangerous cutting tools. While most of the functional machinery had been salvaged years ago, the room was still cluttered with rusted scrap metal, broken iron tables, and deactivated, ominous-looking control boxes. The team worked quickly, setting up a makeshift studio with soft boxes and backdrops to shoot product close-ups and character portraits. To maximize efficiency, Olive and Ryan had even hauled 2 of the department's fastest computers into the workshop, creating a temporary editing workstation so they could compile the film on site. By the 3rd day of working in the basement, the atmosphere had lightened slightly. They had successfully finished shooting all the raw footage and were now deep into the tedious process of editing and sound mixing. To celebrate, Ryan had bought a bag of local fried chicken and a few cans of beer to help everyone unwind. They sat around the glowing editing monitors, eating and chatting. Suddenly, the casual atmosphere shattered. Olive, who had been sitting with his large over-ear headphones on, froze. He slowly pulled the headphones down around his neck, his face entirely drained of color, glistening with a cold sweat. He looked at the others and stammered, saying he had just uncovered an incomprehensible piece of audio hidden within their recordings. Curious but unnerved, the group gathered behind his chair. Olive turned up the external studio monitors and played a track. It was a recording of May performing a voiceover monologue meant for the classroom scene. Through the speakers, May's clear, resonant voice spoke about standing still and feeling the flow of time. Then, Olive reached over to the mixing board. He boosted the volume to an extreme level and applied a heavy filter to cut out the low-frequency background hum of the room. He played it again. Behind May's clear voice, embedded deep within the track, was another sound. It was an incredibly strained, raspy sobbing. It sounded like a person trying to weep with a throat entirely clogged with wet sand and gravel. The voice choked out an agonizing question, repeatedly asking why it was still like this, why nothing had changed, followed by a low, pathetic wail. May clutched her arms, trembling violently, desperately asking where that sound could have possibly come from. Olive, wanting to be sure, replayed the filtered audio one more time, cranking the volume higher. The weeping grew clearer, echoing painfully in the hollow workshop. Before anyone could speak, a sharp, metallic screech ripped through the air. Nobody had been watching the entrance, but the massive, heavy iron roller shutter door suddenly activated on its own. With a deafening, echoing crash, the metal door slammed violently into the concrete floor, sealing the only exit. The girls shrieked in terror. Ryan immediately bolted across the room toward the wall-mounted electrical box that controlled the shutter. He slammed his hand onto the up button, but the motor didn't engage. Suddenly, a violent shower of bright blue sparks exploded from the circuit box, accompanied by a thick cloud of acrid black smoke. The power to the door was completely dead. Ryan kicked the wall in frustration, shouting that the mechanism was entirely broken. Dania tried to keep her head. She ordered them to call the department office, then quickly corrected herself, realizing everyone had gone home for the evening. She ran to the wall-mounted campus landline phone and lifted the receiver. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The thick black phone line hanging beneath the unit had been violently severed, the frayed, uneven copper wires dangling loosely. It looked as though rats had chewed through it long ago. This took place in an era before every student carried a mobile phone in their pocket. They were truly, completely isolated. The only window in the entire workshop was a narrow, high-set horizontal opening that faced an unlit, overgrown garden bed at the back of the building. It was past 8 in the evening. No one would be walking through that remote part of the campus. Screaming for help would be entirely useless. Aleph tried to force a sense of calm. He grabbed a can of beer, cracked it open, and took a heavy gulp. His voice shook as he suggested they simply wait until morning, arguing that since they couldn't get out anyway, they might as well just sit tight and drink. They opened their cans and clinked them together, but the toast was hollow. Their eyes kept darting into the vast, dark corners of the workshop. Dania looked at her friends, her voice heavy with guilt as she apologized, admitting she had never expected the urban legends surrounding these rooms to be so horrifyingly real. May softly comforted her, saying no one blamed her, and that because it was a team decision, they all shared the responsibility. Without warning, a heavy, metallic crash echoed from the center of their set. Their heavy aluminum camera tripod was violently thrown to the ground, as if kicked by an invisible, powerful force. In the next second, Ryan collapsed onto the concrete floor. He began to convulse violently, his large frame thrashing and rolling across the dusty ground. His jaw snapped repeatedly as he mumbled a stream of rapid, incoherent words in a voice that didn't sound like his own. May and Dania screamed, tears streaming down their faces. Aleph lunged forward, trying with all his might to pin Ryan's shoulders down, but it was useless. Ryan's body felt impossibly heavy, dense like a rolling cannonball, tossing Aleph aside effortlessly. Thinking fast, Dania ran to a pile of old maintenance supplies at the back of the room. She retrieved a thick bundle of red plastic packing rope. Combining their remaining strength, Dania, May, and Aleph threw themselves onto Ryan, pinning him just long enough to hoist him into a heavy wooden chair and bind his arms and torso securely. By the time they finished, Ryan's forehead was gashed and bleeding from where he had repeatedly struck the concrete floor during his convulsions. The 3 remaining students ran to the narrow window, pulling themselves up to shout into the night. They screamed until their throats were completely hoarse and raw, but the dark orchards outside remained dead silent. From behind them, Ryan let out a horrific sound, a mixture of a manic laugh and a desperate sob. He mocked them, shouting that they would never leave this place alive. A sudden, deafening explosion rocked the room as the main circuit breaker blew out entirely. The workshop was instantly plunged into near total darkness. The only illumination came from the sickly, dim green glow of a wall-mounted emergency exit sign. May buried her face in Dania's shoulder, weeping uncontrollably. Ryan began to thrash violently against his restraints, making the wooden chair splinter and rattle against the floor. He began to scream frantically, warning them that it was finally inside the room. Olive, his hands shaking uncontrollably, pulled a small, weak plastic flashlight from his bag, turned it on, and set it flat on a desk, aiming the beam across the room. He huddled beside the girls, his entire body trembling. May pointed a shaking finger into the dim beam of light and shrieked. Through the faint illumination, the three students watched in absolute horror as a tall, solid human silhouette walked clean through a row of locked metal storage lockers, disappearing into the deepest, unlit section of the workshop. They screamed in unison. There was nowhere left to run. They were trapped like sheep waiting for the slaughter. Guided by the eerie green emergency light, they looked toward the back of the room where an old, disconnected electric smelting furnace stood. Standing right beside it was the dark silhouette of a man. May caught sight of his face and let out a breathless scream. Olive, driven by pure, primal panic, grabbed a heavy iron pot from a nearby prop table and hurled it into the darkness, cursing at the entity and screaming for it to get out. From the shadows, the dark figure pulled its lips back, revealing a row of stark, gleaming white teeth. It smiled at them. From the chair, Ryan's head snapped up. Using a voice that was deep, gravelly, and completely devoid of humanity, he boomed out that they would all belong to this room forever, followed by a chilling laugh. Dania forced her eyes away from the smiling shadow, desperately looking around the immediate area. Her flashlight beam caught a long, rusted iron poker resting against an old boiler, a tool once used to clear out hot coals. A desperate plan formed in her mind. She turned to Olive, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror, instructing him to look through the back shelves for a bottle of chemical degreaser or cleaning solvent. She then turned to May, telling her to find the bundle of steel wire she remembered seeing on top of the main storage cabinet. Once the items were gathered, Dania looked at Olive and told him to take off his thick, 100% cotton undershirt. She wrapped the thick fabric tightly around the tip of the long iron poker, using May's steel wire to bind it securely. She then poured the highly flammable cleaning solvent over the fabric until it was completely saturated. Pulling a plastic lighter from her pocket, she struck the flint. A massive, violent burst of orange flame erupted from the torch, instantly illuminating every corner of the dark workshop. The sudden light caused the smiling shadow in the corner to flinch, retreating deeper into the recess of the furnace. Dania didn't waste a second. She and May grabbed a heavy steel desk chair, dragging it directly beneath the ceiling-mounted smoke detector. She handed the blazing torch to Olive, ordering him to hold the fire directly underneath the plastic sensor. Dania grit her teeth, staring up at the device, silently begging it to work. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the dark, shadowy figure slowly creeping back out from behind the furnace, its white teeth bared in a mocking sneer. After 5 agonizing seconds of intense heat and thick black smoke, the workshop's overhead system clicked. Suddenly, the loud, piercing blare of the campus fire alarm erupted through the entire building. Red strobe lights flashed violently in the hallways outside. It didn't take long. Within 20 minutes, the campus night security guard and a few administrative staff members who were still on campus came rushing down to the basement wing. Hearing the muffled screams of the students from behind the iron shutter, they immediately called an emergency technician and the local fire department. By midnight, the heavy iron door had been completely breached, and the 4 traumatized students were pulled out into the cool night air. Ryan, who had finally stopped convulsing but remained completely catatonic and covered in bruises, was rushed into the back of an awaiting ambulance. When the emergency roller shutter technician inspected the door later that night, he shook his head in disbelief. He explained to the school staff that the internal gears and track of the door had been heavily rusted and completely seized up for years. Mechanically speaking, it was physically impossible for that door to have rolled down on its own. He had no explanation for how it had closed, noting that the fire department had to use a heavy circular rescue saw to cut a hole large enough to pull the students out. Dania, May, and Olive sat huddled in the main administrative office, wrapped in blankets, silently waiting for their parents to arrive. The department head and the school campus minister stood a few feet away, speaking in hushed, incredibly tense whispers after hearing the student's full statement. Years later, Dania would look back on that night, remarking to her friends that their graduation project had very nearly become the final chapter of their lives. Ryan spent an entire month in the psychiatric ward of the regional hospital before his mental state slowly stabilized, his physical injuries healing much faster than his mind. As for the college, the administration quietly brought in a spiritual medium to perform a massive, multi-day cleansing ritual throughout the entire basement wing. Every single piece of old furniture, obsolete computer gear, and metalworking machinery was completely cleared out and disposed of. A brand new, heavily reinforced roller shutter door was installed over the entrance of the wing and locked with multiple heavy padlocks. Whatever entities refused to leave that basement were permanently sealed away in the dark, never to be disturbed again.